The unexpected encounter. The late afternoon sun cast a golden hue over the streets of Greenwood, a modest neighborhood with old but proud homes. Corey Simmons, a 14-year-old boy with dark brown skin, bright eyes, and a heart as big as the world, was making his way home after a long day at school. He had been practicing basketball with some friends at the local park, his worn sneakers rhythmically hitting the cracked pavement beneath his feet. His thoughts wandered to the struggles his family was going through. His father had been laid off from work, and his mother was juggling 2 jobs just to make ends meet. Despite the heavy burden weighing on his heart, Corey had a natural resilience about him. He always managed to find a way to stay hopeful, no matter how hard things got. As he turned the corner towards his house, something on the ground caught his eye. A small object partially hidden under the shadow of a tree. Curious, Corey walked over to it and found a wallet. It was old and brown, with creases that told stories of years of use. He bent down to pick it up, feeling the weight of it in its hands. His first instinct was to leave it where it was, just as his mother had always taught him. But there was something about the wallet that made him hesitate. His fingers ran over the worn leather, and he realized this wasn't just an ordinary item. It belonged to someone who might need it back. Corey glanced around the street. There was no one in sight, just the sound of distant traffic and the occasional chirping of birds. Should he open it? Should he take it to the police? Should he leave it behind and pretend he never saw it? His mind raced with questions. His family could really use the money if there was any in the wallet, but the idea of keeping it made Corey feel uneasy. His mother had always raised him to do the right thing, even when no one was watching. After a moment's hesitation, Corey decided to open the wallet. His hand shook slightly as he unclasped the button, revealing a small stack of old cards, a few receipts, and something surprising: a photo. There was no cash inside, but the photograph immediately caught his attention. It was faded and yellowed with age, showing a woman with kind eyes and a warm smile. The edges of the photo were worn, and it looked like it had been carried in this wallet for a very long time. Next to the photograph, there was a folded piece of paper, but Corey's attention quickly shifted to an ID card tucked in one of the pockets. The name on it read, Harold Abbott, with an address just a few blocks from where Corey was standing. Corey felt a sense of responsibility wash over him. The man who owned this wallet was likely worried sick. Without giving it much more thought, Corey closed the wallet and began walking toward the address on the ID card. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows over the houses, and a cool breeze rustled the trees overhead. As he walked, Corey's mind raced. Who was Mr. Abbott? Would he be happy to get his wallet back? What if something bad happened because he lost it? Corey couldn't shake the thought that this wallet, with its worn leather and precious photograph, held something more than just belongings. It held memories, pieces of a life. When Corey finally reached the address, he found himself standing in front of an old, weathered house. The paint was peeling, and the windows looked like they hadn't been cleaned in years, but there was something welcoming about the place. The garden in front was overgrown, but colorful flowers bloomed wildly, as if refusing to be tamed by time. Corey hesitated for a moment, his nerves getting the best of him. What if Mr. Abbott didn't remember losing his wallet? What if he thought Corey had stolen it? But shaking off his doubts, Corey took a deep breath and rang the doorbell. For a few seconds, there was nothing but the soft hum of the wind. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the sound of shuffling footsteps echoed from inside the house. The door creaked open, revealing an elderly man with a head of wispy white hair and a slight hunch in his posture. His eyes, though clouded with age, were sharp and observant. He peered out at Corey, a mix of curiosity and wariness crossing his face. "Yes?" the old man asked, his voice raspy but gentle. Corey swallowed nervously, clutching the wallet a little tighter in his hand. "Bob, Mr. Abbott?" he asked tentatively, glancing down at the ID card one last time to make sure he had the right name. As soon as Corey walked through the front door, his younger sister Jasmine ran up to him, her eyes wide with excitement. "Corey, there are police outside. They want to talk to you." Corey froze in his tracks, his heart suddenly pounding in his chest. "Police? What? Why?" Jasmine just shrugged, clearly more thrilled about the excitement of police officers at their house than understanding the seriousness of the situation. "I don't know. Mom said you should come outside." Corey felt a wave of confusion and fear wash over him. Why would the police want to talk to him? He hadn't done anything wrong, had he? His mind raced as he tried to think of a reason why the police would be at his door. He had returned the wallet to Mr. Abbott, so what could this be about? Taking a deep breath, Corey made his way outside, where his mother was already speaking with two uniformed officers standing by their patrol car. His father stood nearby, arms crossed, looking concerned. One of the officers, a tall man with a stern expression, turned to look at Corey as he approached. "Are you Corey Simmons?" the officer asked. Corey nodded, his voice catching in his throat. "Ah, yes, that's me. Is something wrong?" The second officer, a shorter woman with kind eyes, stepped forward, her tone softer than her partner's. "Corey, we're here to ask you some questions about a wallet you found yesterday. You returned it to an elderly man named Harold Abbott, correct?" Corey's heart sank. Did Mr. Abbott think he had done something wrong? He had returned the wallet. Why would the police be asking about it? Nervously, Corey nodded again. "Yeah, I found it at the park and took it back to him. I didn't do anything wrong. I just thought he would want it back." The taller officer exchanged a glance with his partner before speaking again. "We're not here to accuse you of anything, Corey. In fact, Mr. Abbott spoke very highly of you when we talked to him earlier today." Corey blinked in surprise. "He did?" "Yes, he did," the female officer confirmed with a small smile. "But there's something unusual about this wallet, and we wanted to clarify a few things with you. When you found the wallet, did you notice anything out of the ordinary?" Corey furrowed his brow, trying to remember. "Well, there wasn't any money in it, just some cards, a picture, and a piece of paper. I didn't really look at the paper, though." The officers exchanged another glance, this time more serious. The taller officer spoke again. "That piece of paper, it was a letter, correct? Did you happen to read any part of it?" Corey shook his head, confused. "No, I didn't. I just thought it was something personal, so I left it alone." The officers both seemed to relax slightly at his response, but there was still an air of tension hanging in the air. The female officer stepped forward again. "Corey, the letter in that wallet was an old will. Mr. Abbott didn't even realize it was in there until he looked through it today." "A will?" Corey repeated, his voice rising in surprise. "Like, a will for after you die?" The officer nodded. "Yes. Apparently, Mr. Abbott wrote it years ago and forgot all about it. But here's the thing. He never filed it officially. It was tucked away in his wallet all this time." Corey's mind reeled as he tried to process this new information. A will? How did a simple act of returning a wallet turn into something this serious? The taller officer crossed his arms, his expression softening. "Mr. Abbott was so grateful that you returned his wallet, especially considering how important that letter turned out to be. He asked us to come here to make sure you understood how much your honesty meant to him. He's an old man who doesn't have much family left, and that will holds a lot of sentimental and legal importance." Corey felt a wave of relief wash over him. So this wasn't about him being in trouble, it was about how important the contents of the wallet were. Still, the weight of the situation settled heavily on his shoulders. He had returned more than just a wallet. He had unknowingly safeguarded a man's future, a piece of his legacy. The female officer smiled at Corey, her tone warm. "You did a really good thing, Corey. It's not every day we come across someone as honest and responsible as you. Mr. Abbott wanted us to let you know that he's going to update his will properly, but you've already done more for him than you realize." Corey felt his heart swell with pride, but also with a sense of awe. He hadn't just done the right thing. He had protected something incredibly valuable. As the officers thanked him and left, Corey stood there, watching them drive away. still trying to wrap his head around everything that had just happened. When his parents came up to him, their expressions a mixture of concern and pride, Corey knew that life had just taken an unexpected turn. Little did he know, this was only the beginning of a series of events that would change not just his life, but Mr. Abbott's, in ways he never could have imagined. The unraveling mystery. The days after the police visit passed slowly for Corey. His initial shock and relief had faded, leaving behind a strange mix of curiosity and unease. The thought of Mr. Abbott's will, tucked away in that old wallet for years, weighed heavily on his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to the story, something that didn't quite make sense. Why had Mr. Abbott carried such an important document in his wallet, forgotten for so long? And why had the police come to his door about it? Corey was only 14, but the gravity of the situation wasn't lost on him. Life at home continued as usual. His father was still searching for a job, combing through classifieds and online postings with a quiet determination. His mother was working longer hours, and his little sister Jasmine remained blissfully unaware of the tension that seemed to hang in the air. But Corey's thoughts kept drifting back to Mr. Abbott. One afternoon, as Corey sat on the porch steps after school, tossing a basketball back and forth between his hands, he made a decision. He needed to talk to Mr. Abbott again. Maybe it was just his own curiosity getting the better of him, or maybe he felt some strange responsibility to understand more about the old man's story. Either way, Corey found himself standing in front of Mr. Abbott's house once again, just a few days after their first encounter. The house looked as weathered and tired as it had before, with its peeling paint and overgrown garden. But now, Corey felt a deeper connection to the place, as though he had uncovered something beneath the surface of its worn exterior. He took a deep breath and rang the doorbell. It took a moment before the familiar shuffling footsteps approached, and the door creaked open. Mr. Abbott appeared in the doorway, his blue eyes squinting against the sunlight. When he saw Corey standing there, a smile spread across his wrinkled face. "Well, if it isn't the young man who saved my old bones from a heap of trouble," Mr. Abbott said, his voice warm and welcoming. "What brings you back here, Corey?" Corey shifted awkwardly, unsure of how to start. "I was just, wondering how you're doing, after everything with the wallet and the police and all." Mr. Abbott chuckled softly and stepped aside, gesturing for Corey to come in. "Well, I'm doing just fine, thanks to you. Come on in, boy. I was just about to make myself some tea. You like tea?" Corey had never really been much of a tea drinker, but he nodded anyway and followed Mr. Abbott into the house. The interior of the home was cozy but cluttered, filled with old furniture, books stacked in uneven piles, and faded photographs on every wall. The air smelled faintly of dust and something sweet, like vanilla. It was a place that felt lived in, a place with stories hidden in every corner. Mr. Abbott led Corey to the small kitchen, where a kettle was already whistling on the stove. As the old man poured the tea into two mismatched cups, Corey couldn't help but notice the framed photo on the windowsill. The same woman from the wallet, smiling warmly in a picture that looked like it had been taken decades ago. "That's her, isn't it?" Corey asked, pointing to the photo. "The woman in your wallet." Mr. Abbott paused, his hand hovering over the kettle. His expression softened, and he nodded. "Yes, that's my Lydia. She passed away many years ago, but she's never far from my thoughts. She was the love of my life." Corey felt a lump form in his throat at the old man's words. There was such deep affection in Mr. Abbott's voice, a quiet sorrow that made Corey realize just how much that photograph meant to him. The wallet hadn't just been about money or documents. It had carried a piece of Mr. Abbott's heart. As they sat down at the small kitchen table, sipping their tea in silence for a moment, Corey finally gathered the courage to ask the question that had been on his mind since the police visit. "Mr. Abbott, about that will. Why did you have it in your wallet? I mean, I don't really know much about that stuff, but it seems like something important to just forget about." Mr. Abbott let out a long sigh, setting his cup down gently on the table. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes distant as though he were looking into a time far in the past. "It's a long story, Corey," he began, his voice tinged with both weariness and nostalgia. "I wrote that will shortly after Lydia passed. I was younger then, though it doesn't feel like it. I didn't have much family left, you see. Just a nephew who lives in another state, and we don't talk much. Lydia and I never had children, so I didn't think too much about my estate. I figured I'd leave what little I had to charity, maybe some to my nephew, and that would be the end of it." Corey listened intently, leaning forward slightly as Mr. Abbott continued. "But as time went on, I started to lose track of things. Life became quieter after Lydia died. I kept the will in my wallet because I didn't trust myself to remember where I put it if I tucked it away somewhere else. But as you know, time has a funny way of slipping by. Days turn into weeks, weeks into years. And before I knew it, I'd forgotten all about that letter in my wallet." Mr. Abbott sighed again, his eyes clouded with memories. "It wasn't until you brought the wallet back to me that I even remembered it was there. And when I read through it, I realized how outdated it was. Things have changed since I wrote it, and honestly, I'm not sure what I want to do now." Corey frowned, trying to piece everything together. "But why did the police come to my house? I mean, it's not like I did anything wrong." Mr. Abbott chuckled softly. "No, Corey, you didn't do anything wrong. Quite the opposite, in fact. The police were involved because of the nature of the document. You see, when I realized the will was still in my wallet, I contacted a lawyer friend of mine to make sure everything was in order. But the will was never officially registered, which is why they needed to verify a few things. I didn't mean to cause you any trouble, son. I just didn't expect to find something so important tucked away after all these years." Corey sat back in his chair, feeling a strange mix of relief and responsibility. He hadn't expected any of this when he picked up that wallet. It was starting to dawn on him that his simple act of kindness had set off a chain of events that were far more complex than he'd imagined. Mr. Abbott had unknowingly carried around an unfiled will for years, and now it was up to him to decide what to do next. "Are you going to update it?" Corey asked quietly, his fingers tracing the edge of his teacup. Mr. Abbott nodded slowly. "I think it's time. I'm not getting any younger, and I want to make sure everything is settled before it's too late. But you've done more than just return a wallet, Corey. You've reminded me that there's still time to set things right." For the next hour, the two of them sat together, talking about life, loss, and the importance of making things right. Corey felt a strange sense of responsibility growing inside him. It wasn't just about returning a lost wallet anymore. He had become part of Mr. Abbott's story, part of something much bigger than he'd ever expected. As Corey left Mr. Abbott's house that afternoon, the sky darkening with the first hints of evening, he couldn't shake the feeling that his connection to the old man wasn't over. There were still pieces of the puzzle missing, still unanswered questions about the will, about Mr. Abbott's past, and about the mysterious woman in the photograph. And Corey couldn't help but wonder, was it fate that had brought him to this moment, or was it something else entirely? The mystery was far from solved, and Corey knew that there was more to come. Little did he know, the events that were about to unfold would take him deeper into Mr. Abbott's life, into a story that would change everything he thought he knew about kindness, responsibility, and the power of a single act of honesty. The hidden truth. The days after Corey's second visit to Mr. Abbott's house felt different. There was a quiet tension in the air, a weight he couldn't shake, and it wasn't just because of the looming will. Mr. Abbott's story had sparked something deeper in Corey, an unease that the old man's life held more secrets than he let on. Though Corey hadn't expected to be drawn into the complexities of someone else's life, there was something about Mr. Abbott that made him feel responsible, almost protective. The conversation they'd shared over tea still echoed in his mind, and the photograph of Lydia, her warm smile frozen in time, haunted his thoughts. It was a Saturday afternoon when Corey found himself back at the park where he'd first found Mr. Abbott's wallet. The air was crisp, with autumn's chill beginning to creep in. Fallen leaves crunched under his feet as he walked, lost in thought. He clutched his basketball, bouncing it absent-mindedly as he made his way toward the old swings. The park was mostly empty, save for a few kids playing on the jungle gym, and a couple walking their dog. As Corey approached the swings, a familiar figure caught his eye. Mr. Abbott sat on a weathered park bench, his cane resting beside him, staring out across the park with a distant look in his eyes. Surprised to see him there, Corey hesitated for a moment before walking over. "Mr. Abbott," Corey called out gently, unsure if the old man had even noticed him. Mr. Abbott turned slowly, a faint smile appearing on his face as he recognized Corey. "Well, well, fancy seeing you here, young man," he said, his voice a little softer than usual. "What brings you to the park on a day like this?" Corey shrugged, bouncing his basketball lightly against the ground. "Just needed some fresh air, I guess. What about you?" Mr. Abbott looked back toward the swings, his eyes clouded with nostalgia. "This park holds a lot of memories for me, you know. My Lydia and I used to come here all the time when we were young. Back then, this place was livelier, full of families, children laughing, people enjoying the day. It's quieter now, but it still feels like home." Corey sat down on the bench beside him, feeling the weight of Mr. Abbott's words. He could sense there was more to the old man's story, something hidden beneath the surface, and he felt a pull to dig deeper. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," Corey began hesitantly, "about your will and about Lydia. It just seems like there's more to the story. Like maybe you've been carrying something with you for a long time." Mr. Abbott didn't respond right away. He simply stared out at the park, his gaze fixed on the old swing set swaying gently in the breeze. For a long moment, the only sound was the rustling of leaves and the distant chatter of the children playing. Then, with a heavy sigh, he finally spoke. "You're a perceptive young man, Corey. I suppose there is more to the story, but some things are hard to talk about, especially when they've been buried for so long." Corey waited, giving Mr. Abbott the space he needed. He could tell that whatever the old man was about to share was difficult for him, and he didn't want to rush him. "I never told anyone this," Mr. Abbott continued, his voice low and pensive. "But Lydia and I didn't have the perfect life everyone thought we did. We were happy, yes, very happy for many years. But there was a part of our life that was always missing, a void we couldn't fill, no matter how much we loved each other." He paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "We wanted children, you see, desperately, but it wasn't in the cards for us. Lydia, she couldn't have children. We tried for years, went to doctors, tried every treatment available at the time, but nothing worked. It broke her heart, and, truth be told, it broke mine too." Corey felt a pang of sadness as Mr. Abbott's words sank in. He hadn't expected this. The thought of the kind old man sitting beside him, carrying such deep sorrow for so many years, made Corey's chest tighten with empathy. "Lydia was strong," Mr. Abbott said, his voice growing softer, "stronger than anyone I've ever known. She didn't let the disappointment consume her. Instead, she poured all of her love and energy into helping others. She worked with children at the local hospital, volunteered at the community center, and always found a way to make people feel cared for. But I knew that deep down, she carried that loss with her every day." Mr. Abbott's hand trembled slightly as he rested it on his cane, his eyes distant as though he were seeing Lydia's face in the wind. "And as for me," he continued, "I did my best to be strong for her, but there were times when I wasn't. Times when the pain of not having a family of our own weighed too heavily on me. I withdrew. I shut down. And though we never spoke of it, I know that hurt her. It's something I've regretted for the rest of my life." Corey sat in silence, unsure of what to say. He had never considered that someone like Mr. Abbott, who seemed so calm and collected, could be carrying such a heavy burden of regret. The revelation made Corey think about his own family, his parents' struggles, his sister's innocence, and his own desire to help in any way he could. He realized then that life was often far more complicated than it appeared on the surface. So, Corey asked quietly, "What happened after Lydia passed?" Mr. Abbott's expression grew even more somber. "When Lydia died, I was lost, completely adrift. I had no one left, no purpose. I stopped caring about things, about the house, about my health, even about my own future. That's when I wrote the will, hastily, without thinking it through. I was ready to leave everything behind. But I never filed it because, well, I suppose I wasn't quite ready to give up after all." Corey felt a chill run down his spine. There was something about the way Mr. Abbott spoke, as though he had been teetering on the edge of despair for years, that unsettled him. And yet there was a glimmer of hope in the old man's words, a sense that perhaps, despite everything, Mr. Abbott had found a reason to keep going. "You found a way to keep going," Corey said, more to himself than to Mr. Abbott. The old man nodded slowly. "I did, but not without help. After Lydia passed, I threw myself into the things she loved. The hospital, the community center. I volunteered with the same children she had cared for, hoping that in some small way I could honor her memory. And that's when I realized something important, something that had taken me years to understand." He turned to Corey, his eyes sharp despite his age. "We don't always get to choose the life we want, Corey, but we do get to choose how we live the life we're given. Lydia didn't have children of her own, but she made a difference in so many young lives. And in her own way, she became a mother to those children. I never saw it that way until after she was gone." Corey felt a lump rise in his throat. The weight of Mr. Abbott's words hit him harder than he expected. The old man had found a way to live on, to find meaning in the midst of his loss. And in that moment, Corey realized that his connection to Mr. Abbott was more than just a chance encounter. It was part of something larger, something that had brought them together for a reason. "Mr. Abbott," Corey began, his voice thick with emotion, "you've been through so much. I can't imagine how hard it's been for you, but I'm glad you shared this with me. I don't know why, but I feel like maybe I was meant to find your wallet, like maybe I was supposed to help you with all of this." The old man smiled, his eyes softening. "Perhaps you were, Corey. Perhaps you were." As they sat there together, the park bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, Corey couldn't help but feel that his life had changed in ways he couldn't yet fully understand. He had stumbled into Mr. Abbott's story by accident, but now he felt a deep sense of responsibility to see it through, to help the old man find peace, just as Lydia had done for so many others. And though the mystery of the will had been solved, Corey knew that the real story was just beginning. A dark revelation. The following week felt like a whirlwind for Corey. Between school, basketball practice, and the weight of Mr. Abbott's revelations, Corey found himself struggling to focus. His mind kept drifting back to the old man, the sadness in his voice when he spoke about Lydia, and the unexpected connection they had formed. There was something about their shared conversations that lingered in Corey's thoughts, something unfinished. The day after their talk in the park, Corey had gone back to visit Mr. Abbott, hoping to check on him and maybe help out with some of the housework. But when he knocked on the door, there had been no answer. The house was eerily quiet, and for a moment, Corey had been afraid something might have happened to the old man. But the next-door neighbor, Mrs. Davis, reassured him that Mr. Abbott had likely gone to the hospital to volunteer, as he often did. Still, something didn't sit right with Corey. Why hadn't Mr. Abbott told him he was leaving? After their deep conversation in the park, Corey had expected to see him again, but now there was a growing sense of uncertainty gnawing at him. That evening, Corey decided to visit the local library to do some research. Something Mr. Abbott had said about Lydia's work at the hospital kept playing in his head. She had spent years helping children, pouring her heart into their care. But there was a weight in Mr. Abbott's words that hinted at more. Corey had seen the pain in his eyes when he spoke of their struggles to have children, and he couldn't shake the feeling that Lydia's work and her death might be part of a larger story. At the library, Corey pulled up old records and articles about the hospital where Lydia had volunteered. The dim glow of the computer screen illuminated his face as he scrolled through years of archived newspapers. There were dozens of mentions of Lydia Abbott, her dedication to the children, the awards she had won for her work, the heartfelt tributes written after her death. It was clear that Lydia had been beloved in the community. But there was something missing, something just out of reach. As Corey dug deeper, he found an article that caught his eye. It was dated over 2 decades ago, not long before Lydia's death. The headline read, "Local Hospital Under Investigation for Alleged Misconduct in Pediatric Wing." Corey's heart skipped a beat. Misconduct. He clicked on the article, his hands trembling slightly as the page loaded. The article detailed an investigation that had been launched into the hospital's pediatric wing following several anonymous reports of negligence. The reports claimed that some children had been mistreated, their conditions worsened due to improper care, and that some nurses had been covering up mistakes to avoid punishment. Corey's pulse quickened as he read through the allegations. There was no mention of Lydia Abbott in the article, but the timing was uncanny. She had been working at the hospital during that period. Could she have known about this? Corey's mind raced as he tried to piece together the fragments of information. If Lydia had been involved in some way, either as a whistleblower or as someone who had witnessed the misconduct, it might explain the weight Mr. Abbott carried. But why hadn't he mentioned it? Was it possible that Lydia's death was connected to this dark chapter in the hospital's history? Just as Corey was about to close the article, something caught his eye. At the bottom of the page, there was a short mention of a nurse named Margaret Davis, Mrs. Davis, Mr. Abbott's next-door neighbor. According to the article, Margaret had been a senior nurse at the hospital during the investigation. Corey's stomach tightened. Mrs. Davis had never mentioned her connection to the hospital. She had always seemed like a kind old woman who looked after Mr. Abbott, but now Corey couldn't help but wonder if she knew more than she was letting on. The discovery left Corey feeling uneasy. There was a dark undercurrent to Lydia's story that he hadn't anticipated. He had come to Mr. Abbott's home with the simple goal of returning a lost wallet, but now it seemed like he had stumbled into a much larger mystery, one that might involve lies, secrets, and a tragedy that no one had fully acknowledged. The next day, Corey decided to confront Mrs. Davis. He had to know the truth, even if it meant unearthing painful memories. After school, he made his way to her house, rehearsing what he would say in his mind. When he reached her front door, he hesitated for a moment before knocking. Mrs. Davis opened the door with a warm smile, her silver hair neatly pinned back. "Corey, dear, how nice to see you again. Is everything all right?" "Hi, Mrs. Davis," Corey said, shifting nervously on his feet. I was wondering if I could talk to you about something. It's about Mr. Abbott and Lydia." Mrs. Davis's smile faltered slightly, but she nodded and stepped aside to let him in. "Of course, dear. Come in." The living room was cozy, filled with knickknacks and framed photos of Mrs. Davis's family. Corey sat down on the edge of the couch, his heart racing as he tried to figure out how to begin. "I was at the library yesterday," Corey said slowly, "and I found an old article about the hospital where Lydia worked. It mentioned some kind of investigation into the pediatric wing. And, well, your name was in the article too." Mrs. Davis's expression darkened. She sat down in the armchair across from Corey, folding her hands in her lap. For a long moment, she said nothing, her eyes distant, as if she were remembering something painful. "That was a long time ago, Corey," she said quietly. "A time I'd rather not revisit." "I understand," Corey replied, "but I think it's important. Mr. Abbott, he's been carrying so much pain, and I think it might be connected to what happened at the hospital. I just want to help him." Mrs. Davis sighed, her shoulders slumping as the weight of the past settled over her. "Harold has always been a good man, but after Lydia passed, he was never the same. You're right. What happened at the hospital is part of the reason. But it's not something that's easy to talk about. She paused, as if gathering her strength, before continuing. The investigation. It was a mess. There were children who didn't get the care they needed, and some of the nurses. They made mistakes. Terrible mistakes. But the hospital administration wanted to sweep it all under the rug. Lydia, bless her heart, couldn't stand by and watch it happen. She tried to report what she knew, but it was too late. By the time the investigation started, they had already covered their tracks. Corey felt a chill run down his spine. Did Lydia's death have anything to do with that? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. As Corey dug deeper, he found an article that caught his eye. It was dated over 2 decades ago, not long before Lydia's death. The headline read, "Local Hospital Under Investigation for Alleged Misconduct in Pediatric Wing." Corey's heart skipped a beat. Misconduct. He clicked on the article, his hands trembling slightly as the page loaded. The article detailed an investigation that had been launched into the hospital's pediatric wing following several anonymous reports of negligence. The reports claimed that some children had been mistreated, their conditions worsened due to improper care, and that some nurses had been covering up mistakes to avoid punishment. Corey's pulse quickened as he read through the allegations. There was no mention of Lydia Abbott in the article, but the timing was uncanny. She had been working at the hospital during that period. Could she have known about this? Corey's mind raced as he tried to piece together the fragments of information. If Lydia had been involved in some way, either as a whistleblower or as someone who had witnessed the misconduct, it might explain the weight Mr. Abbott carried. But why hadn't he mentioned it? Was it possible that Lydia's death was connected to this dark chapter in the hospital's history? Just as Corey was about to close the article, something caught his eye. At the bottom of the page, there was a short mention of a nurse named Margaret Davis, Mrs. Davis, Mr. Abbott's next-door neighbor. According to the article, Margaret had been a senior nurse at the hospital during the investigation. Corey's stomach tightened. Mrs. Davis had never mentioned her connection to the hospital. She had always seemed like a kind old woman who looked after Mr. Abbott, but now Corey couldn't help but wonder if she knew more than she was letting on. The discovery left Corey feeling uneasy. There was a dark undercurrent to Lydia's story that he hadn't anticipated. He had come to Mr. Abbott's home with the simple goal of returning a lost wallet, but now it seemed like he had stumbled into a much larger mystery, one that might involve lies, secrets, and a tragedy that no one had fully acknowledged. The next day, Corey decided to confront Mrs. Davis. He had to know the truth, even if it meant unearthing painful memories. After school, he made his way to her house, rehearsing what he would say in his mind. When he reached her front door, he hesitated for a moment before knocking. Mrs. Davis opened the door with a warm smile, her silver hair neatly pinned back. "Corey, dear, how nice to see you again. Is everything all right?" "Hi, Mrs. Davis," Corey said, shifting nervously on his feet. I was wondering if I could talk to you about something. It's about Mr. Abbott and Lydia." Mrs. Davis's smile faltered slightly, but she nodded and stepped aside to let him in. "Of course, dear. Come in." The living room was cozy, filled with knickknacks and framed photos of Mrs. Davis's family. Corey sat down on the edge of the couch, his heart racing as he tried to figure out how to begin. "I was at the library yesterday," Corey said slowly, "and I found an old article about the hospital where Lydia worked. It mentioned some kind of investigation into the pediatric wing. And, well, your name was in the article too." Mrs. Davis's expression darkened. She sat down in the armchair across from Corey, folding her hands in her lap. For a long moment, she said nothing, her eyes distant, as if she were remembering something painful. "That was a long time ago, Corey," she said quietly. "A time I'd rather not revisit." "I understand," Corey replied, "but I think it's important. Mr. Abbott, he's been carrying so much pain, and I think it might be connected to what happened at the hospital. I just want to help him." Mrs. Davis sighed, her shoulders slumping as the weight of the past settled over her. Harold has always been a good man, but after Lydia passed, he was never the same. You're right. What happened at the hospital is part of the reason. But it's not something that's easy to talk about. She paused, as if gathering her strength, before continuing. The investigation. It was a mess. There were children who didn't get the care they needed, and some of the nurses. They made mistakes. Terrible mistakes. But the hospital administration wanted to sweep it all under the rug. Lydia, bless her heart, couldn't stand by and watch it happen. She tried to report what she knew, but it was too late. By the time the investigation started, they had already covered their tracks. Corey felt a chill run down his spine. Did Lydia's death have anything to do with that? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Davis looked down at her hands, her eyes filled with sorrow. I don't know, Corey. Lydia was always healthy, but after the investigation, she became distant, as if something had broken inside her. She was under so much stress, and I think it took a toll on her health. I've always wondered if there was more to her sudden passing, but I've never had the heart to dig into it. The room fell silent, the air heavy with unspoken truths. Corey's mind raced as he processed everything he had just learned. Lydia had tried to stand up for what was right, but it had cost her dearly. And Mr. Abbott had been left to pick up the pieces, living with the knowledge that his beloved wife had been caught in something far darker than he had ever imagined. Thank you for telling me, Corey said softly. I think Mr. Abbott needs to know that someone still cares about what happened, that Lydia didn't die in vain. Mrs. Davis nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. You're a good boy, Corey. Harold is lucky to have you looking out for him. Just be careful. Some things are better left in the past. Corey left Mrs. Davis's house with a heavy heart, unsure of what his next step would be. The mystery surrounding Lydia's death had deepened, and now it was clear that the hospital investigation had played a role in her final days. But there were still questions that needed answers, and Corey couldn't shake the feeling that he was closer than ever to uncovering the full truth. As he walked home, the autumn wind whipping through the trees, Corey made a silent promise to himself. He wouldn't stop until he had found out what really happened to Lydia Abbott, no matter where the truth led him. The unraveling truth. The weight of everything Corey had learned hung over him like a storm cloud. Lydia Abbott's life, once so distant and abstract, now felt deeply personal. Her connection to the hospital investigation, the mysterious circumstances of her death, and the pain that lingered in Mr. Abbott's eyes all told a story of loss. But it was a story still shrouded in shadows. Corey knew that if he wanted to help Mr. Abbott, he needed to uncover the whole truth, even if it meant diving into a dark chapter of the past. The days passed in a haze of uncertainty. Mr. Abbott remained elusive, and Corey hadn't seen him since their talk in the park. Each time he visited the house, the windows were dark, and the door remained shut. Corey began to worry that Mr. Abbott might never open up again, but something deep inside urged him to keep pushing. He couldn't shake the feeling that Lydia's story was still unfinished, and Mr. Abbott deserved closure. One evening, Corey sat in his room, staring at the notes he had gathered from the library and his conversations with Mrs. Davis. He had learned about the hospital investigation, the allegations of negligence, and Lydia's attempts to report the misconduct. But there was still one crucial piece missing: the truth about Lydia's death. Mrs. Davis had hinted at it, but no one seemed to know for sure if Lydia's death was truly connected to the events at the hospital. Corey felt as though he was standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down at the truth, but not yet able to reach it. Frustration gnawed at him until, late one night, he made a decision. He would confront the hospital itself. If Lydia's death had anything to do with the investigation, there might still be records or people who remembered. It was a long shot, but Corey had run out of other options. He was determined to find answers, not just for himself, but for Mr. Abbott. The next morning, Corey skipped basketball practice and headed straight to the hospital. It was a sprawling complex, its brick facade stark against the gray October sky. Corey hesitated at the entrance, unsure of what he would say or who he would talk to. But he took a deep breath and pushed open the doors, determined to follow through. Inside, the hospital was bustling with doctors, nurses, and patients moving through the hallways. Corey approached the reception desk, where a tired-looking woman sat typing on a computer. "Excuse me," Corey said, his voice a little shaky. "I'm trying to find out some information about a woman who used to work here. Her name was Lydia Abbott." The receptionist looked up, raising an eyebrow. "Lydia Abbott, that name sounds familiar. But it's been years since she worked here. Why are you asking about her?" Corey hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "I'm a friend of her husband's. I think her death might be connected to something that happened here during an investigation years ago. I want to know the truth." The woman's expression softened, and she glanced around as if checking to make sure no one was listening. Then she leaned in slightly and lowered her voice. "There are a few people still working here who knew Lydia. Dr. Nguyen was one of them. She might be able to help you." Corey's heart raced as the receptionist gave him directions to Dr. Nguyen's office. Thanking her, he made his way down a series of long, sterile hallways until he reached a small office near the end of the corridor. The door was slightly ajar, and Corey could see an older woman inside, her gray hair pulled back into a neat bun as she reviewed a stack of medical files. Corey knocked gently on the door, and Dr. Nguyen looked up. Her sharp eyes softened when she saw him, and she gestured for him to come in. "Can I help you?" "I hope so," Corey said, stepping into the office. "I'm Corey Williams. I've been trying to find out more about Lydia Abbott. She used to work here, and I'm trying to help her husband find some closure. I think her death might be connected to something that happened here during the investigation years ago." Dr. Nguyen's expression darkened at the mention of the investigation, and she leaned back in her chair with a heavy sigh. Lydia was one of the most dedicated nurses I've ever worked with. She cared so deeply for the children. But yes, the investigation. That was a difficult time for all of us. She paused for a moment, as if gathering her thoughts. The investigation was initiated after a series of reports were filed about the pediatric wing. Some children had fallen ill under suspicious circumstances, and there were allegations of negligence. Lydia was not involved in the misconduct, but she was one of the few nurses who spoke up when she realized what was happening. She tried to protect those kids. Corey nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. But what about her death? Do you think it had anything to do with the investigation? Dr. Nguyen's eyes flickered with a mix of sorrow and hesitation. Lydia's death was a tragedy, but officially, it was ruled as a heart attack brought on by stress. However, she hesitated again, her voice lowering. There were rumors that Lydia had been under immense pressure not just from the hospital administration, but from outside sources as well. She had received anonymous threats, warning her to stop speaking out. I always suspected that the stress from the investigation and those threats played a role in her sudden passing, but I could never prove it. Corey's stomach churned at the thought of Lydia being harassed and threatened for trying to do the right thing. "Do you think someone hurt her?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Dr. Nguyen shook her head slowly. "I don't think anyone physically harmed her, but the psychological toll was immense. Lydia was a fighter, but even the strongest people have their limits. She carried the weight of those children's lives on her shoulders, and it eventually broke her." Corey sat in silence, absorbing the weight of Dr. Nguyen's words. Lydia had been a hero, trying to protect the most vulnerable, but in the end, it had cost her everything. The investigation, the threats, the pressure, it had all contributed to her untimely death, and Mr. Abbott had been left with the burden of her loss. "Is there anything I can do?" Corey asked, feeling a sense of helplessness wash over him. Dr. Nguyen gave him a sad smile. "The truth is already out there, Corey. Lydia did what she could to expose the wrongdoing at the hospital, and the investigation eventually led to changes in how we operate. Her legacy lives on in the children she saved, and in the policies that were put in place because of her bravery. But if you want to help Mr. Abbott, remind him of that. Remind him that Lydia's sacrifice wasn't in vain. Corey nodded, feeling a mix of grief and determination swell within him. He thanked Dr. Nguyen for her time and left the hospital with a heavy heart, but a renewed sense of purpose. Lydia's story was one of courage, loss, and sacrifice, but it was also a story of hope. She had stood up for what was right, even when it cost her everything. And that was something worth honoring. The next day, Corey made his way back to Mr. Abbott's house. This time, when he knocked on the door, it opened almost immediately. Mr. Abbott stood in the doorway, his eyes tired but warm. "Corey," he said softly, "I've been meaning to thank you for everything." Corey stepped inside, his heart pounding as he prepared to share what he had learned. "Mr. Abbott, I went to the hospital. I spoke to Dr. Nguyen, one of Lydia's old colleagues. She told me about what really happened during the investigation and how Lydia tried to protect those kids." Mr. Abbott's face tightened with emotion, and he sank into his chair. "She was always so brave, but I didn't know how much it had cost her until it was too late." Corey sat down across from him, his voice gentle but firm. "Lydia didn't die in vain, Mr. Abbott. Her work saved lives, and the hospital changed because of what she did. I know it's hard, but you have to remember that. She didn't lose. She won, even if it cost her everything." Tears filled Mr. Abbott's eyes, and for the first time, Corey saw a flicker of peace in his expression. "Thank you, Corey. Thank you for helping me see that." In that moment, Corey realized that the truth wasn't just about uncovering secrets. It was about healing. Lydia's legacy would live on, not in the shadows of her death, but in the light of the lives she had touched. And Mr. Abbott, with Corey's help, could finally begin to heal.